Hi, everyone. So today it looks like we are going to kind of go over some of the stressors of being a dispatcher in, this course, stress of dispatch. Seems like it's mainly focused on just that, but we've also kind of included some stuff at the end that is also talking about the stressors of other support services because this class is necessary mainly because sometimes dispatch is forgot about, let's just be real, right? But we also have kind of noticed that other support services are also kind of back in the wings and have a lot of stressors going on, or the last ones to find things out, to be checked on, and things like that, but are also important. So we're going to mainly go over some dispatch stuff, but there at the end, we'll go over other support services, the stressors that they go through, and how we can help. So I'm assuming that you're here either because you are a dispatcher and you can take this information and bring it with you for peer support training. You're a trainer, and so your incoming people are kind of figuring out this world of dispatching, which is extremely overwhelming. And so you can take this information and bring it to them while you train them too. Or you could also be here because you are an officer, firefighter, paramedic, nurse, whatever else, and you're just kind of expanding your knowledge on other support services that are in this emergency services realm. We're kind of all in this together. So whatever you choose to do with this information, I think that no matter what role you play in, there's different avenues that you can take with it. So I appreciate you being here. I'm super excited to share this with you to kind of start off, just so you know who on earth you're listening to for the next hour or so. My name is Mel, and I was a dispatcher for about 7 years at the Aurora Police Department here in Colorado. And I am now currently in my master's program for military and first responder psychology. So I'm working my way up there to be a therapist specific to military and first responders. So I know a little bit about what I'm talking about, especially when it comes to dispatch. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, let's see. I'm also technologically challenged. Oh, here it is. Okay, so yes, let's talk about stress. Like I said, dispatch edition, but also we'll talk about some other support services there too. As you can tell by this little section here, presentation on sleep deprivation, dark humor, trauma, organizational issues, and a lot of caffeine. That with this presentation, I will bring you a nice little dose of sarcasm. All right, so just to kind of let you know where we're going with this, some things to expect from this course here that we're going to cover is some sleep and shift work, stress and trauma and things that come with that, organizational issues that impact dispatch centers, and of course, like I said, some other support services, how this looks for them and things that they go through. So to start off, I think I have a little there. Oh, there we go. Okay. So to kind of start off with a turnover rate. So the average turnover rate for dispatch centers across the country is about 20%, which doesn't really sound like a whole lot, and we'll talk about this later, but when you are kind of struggling to bring people in, that 20% can take its toll really fast. And that is just the average. Some other centers across the country are also experiencing rates as high as 65%, which will do a real doozy to a center quick if that doesn't get under control. So I encourage you, I mean, if you are a dispatcher, you probably already know what the rate in your dispatch center looks like. But if you are not a dispatcher, I also encourage you to kind of look at what your dispatch center's turnover rates are and the impact that it's having on your center. But with this turnover rate obviously comes overtime, because like fire departments and police departments, right? Dispatch centers are that 24/7, 365 job. And this is requiring centers to do something about it. It's a little bit different than police departments and fire departments, in the sense that with police departments and fire departments, it's a little bit easier to run short. Is it ideal? No, I'm not saying that, police, fire, paramedics, whoever, they just don't care. I'm not saying that at all, but it's a little bit easier to run short. And do dispatch centers run short and kind of spread their people real thin? Absolutely. I don't know really how this looks for other departments, but for dispatch centers, there is a minimum amount of people that you need to run a shift, right? You need people on certain districts and on certain fire channels. You need a certain amount of people that can man the phones, because if someone calls 911 and there's not someone there to answer, we have a greater problem on our hands, right? And so in order to fill in these gaps that we have, that turnover rates are creating, dispatchers are required to work a ton of overtime shifts, on-call shifts, and mandated shifts on their day offs and holidays. And I know that with our other responders, that kind of resonates for you as well. It's a little less likely for you to see police and fire, paramedic personnel to be mandated on their days off, but that is a pretty frequent and common thing that happens within dispatch centers. And so, of course, those turnover rates are going, your center is losing people, the overtime is increasing. And so this is going to have an impact on our sleep, right? Because if you're working a 14, 16-hour shift, those shifts is kind of tapping into your sleeping time. And so things to pay attention to, and I'm sure many of you are going to be like, yeah, I know, this is my daily life, but things to really pay attention to is that symptoms of sleep deprivation include things such as memory issues, trouble with concentration, mood changes, and weakened immunity systems. And so this can be extremely problematic for everyone, but kind of honing in on dispatchers right now. You really don't want a dispatcher that has memory issues, right? I'm sure a lot of you are like, oh, maybe this is affecting the mood that I'm getting back from dispatch, but it's creating issues with memory, concentration on the job, those mood changes, and people are calling out sick left and right, which again, going back to the thing above, that is creating some more overtime. So it's just this constant loop of people leaving, but there's more overtime, people are working more, sleeping less, getting sick, using that sick time, and it's just this constant cycle. This here is a schedule that I grabbed from a coworker of mine that worked at the dispatch center that I did. And I'm sure when you look at this, you're like, what the heck am I looking at? But to kind of explain it to you, these gray squares with the blue dots are days that she worked. So this one being May of 2022, you can see that she worked from May 14th all the way through May 26th without a day off. Then she got the 27th off, yippee, and then started working all over again, at least for 4 days after that. So, I mean, this is why I'm in counseling and not a mathematician, but however many days that is, that's almost 2 weeks straight, right? And so these gray squares, you can also see a little blue circle at the bottom of that. And those blue circles are there to indicate that there is overtime either before or after the shift that you're working that day. So this is kind of your, hey, I know that you're working 12 hours, but what do you think about 14 or, whatever else? And of course, those white squares are the days that she had off. But this goes to show you, this is an actual schedule that a dispatcher was working here in kind of, the Metro Colorado area. But this is not uncommon by any means. This is just coming from the center that I worked at. But if you ask around to either your dispatch center or other centers out there, this is not uncommon to work this many hours or this many shifts in a row. That's just kind of the nature of the beast, which I'm not saying is a great thing, that it's something that we have to accept, but it is something to take into consideration with kind of how we talked about wherever you take this information, something to take into consideration that this is having a big impact on those that are working in your dispatch centers. So the question that we can kind of get is, what do you even do, right? And so I have this little video here so we can see what it is that dispatchers do.
Let's go again. Hand back over the other hand 30 times. Okay. 1.
Or not. It doesn't like it. All right. well, we may just have to skip that, huh? So if you don't know what dispatchers do, there you go. The video's not working, so you can kind of take this and go see what they do. I'm assuming if you're in emergency services, you have a pretty good understanding of what dispatchers do. Now we're getting some of the hype out there, right? Now we're seeing TV shows and movies. Halle Berry's doing stuff. Jake Gyllenhaal's doing dispatcher stuff too. But you can kind of take that. Sorry, the video is not working, but there are now things out there where dispatchers are kind of becoming more recognized. And so what I ended up doing when coming up with a presentation where we're asking dispatchers about their stress is I went out there and I asked dispatchers, at least in my center, what is the most stressful parts about your job? And I think from just some of the times that I presented this, a lot of people are kind of surprised at the answer. And this first one, the number one answer that I got back on what is the most stressful part about your job is helplessness. And so I call this the sit, stare, and panic of dispatching, right? Because different than police work and being a paramedic, responder, nurse, we're kind of tethered to our desks as dispatchers, right? We can't go anywhere or do anything. All we can usually do when we have something come in that's a doozy is the sit, stare, and panic. And so how this kind of plays out with callers is the line that I always used when training was you're only as good as your caller and your GPS. And so if you have a super amazing caller out there that's able to give you their address and is calm enough to kind of provide information to you, that's fantastic. That makes their lives a lot easier. But that doesn't really happen all the time. It's people don't call into 911 because they're having a super amazing time. Well, I mean, sometimes they do that, but most of the time they're in a situation where they require either police, fire, or medical, and that's usually not a super great time. And so if they are unable to provide that information to clear information on what's going on, responder safety information, their address, things like that, the only thing that we really have to fall back on to make sure that as a dispatcher we are doing all that we can do is their GPS, right? Of course, what responders are going on is extremely important, but the number one thing that we need is where they are. Most of the time they can provide this, sometimes they can't. So if you have a caller that's not able to give you any information or the information is unclear, the only other thing that we have to rely on is our GPS. And that can cause this kind of helpless feeling of, I know something really bad is going on. I don't know what it is. I can hear in the background that something is awful and no one is telling me what's happening. And so the only thing that I have is GPS and I have to sit there and listen to it. And another part of this is hearing the very worst with a limited response. So that kind of is like the stare and panic thing, because we can get a call started with just someone's GPS, but that still leaves us sitting there and listening to it. So I can't even tell you how many times that I've taken calls of listening to people literally die. I've had people die with me on the phone quite a bit. They're experiencing chest pain. They can't breathe. They can't give me an address. All I can hear is gasping for air. So my caller's unable to give me information. The only thing that I have is GPS, and hopefully it's not an apartment building, right? Because boy, that causes issues. But and so the only thing I can do is start a call with the very limited information that I have. And I sit there and I sit there and I sit there and I have to listen. This also isn't just with medical calls, right? Just speaking from personal experience, this has also happened with me with listening to people get shot at, to get like physically shot. This has also happened with people being sexually assaulted. I've had to sit there and listen to that and just kind of stare at the little cop cars on the map while I'm listening to these really, really terrible things happen to people. And so that is the sit, stare, and panic that happens with callers, but this also happens with responders too. And so kind of, if you're a dispatcher, you may know, or if you're familiar, so with callers is more of like the call taker realm, but with responders is when we get more into our dispatchers, right? And so I asked around when I was creating this too on what is the scariest thing or the most helpless part of being a dispatcher, and what is the scariest thing that you've heard on the radio? What invokes the most feelings of helplessness? And a lot of people would assume that the scariest things that we hear as dispatchers are, that someone's running, we have an officer that's down, things like that, which, yeah, I'm not going to lie, that is scary, right? But really, the scariest thing that a dispatcher can hear on the radio is just silence. Because there's something that I can do with an officer being down. I mean, I'm not saying that that's not scary. That's not helpless. It absolutely is. But there's something that I can do with that. If I know that an officer is fighting with someone, I can send them more help. If I know an officer is running, I can send them more help and try and figure out where they're at, what direction they're going, and descriptions. But there is nothing that I can do with silence. So that, of course, invokes this strong feeling of helplessness on, I know that something's wrong, but I don't know where they're at and I don't know what they're doing. The example that I always use in this is when I was dispatching, I had an officer who responded to a call of a male that had a knife, and he got on scene by himself. That's how they all start, but he got on scene by himself. And then all of a sudden I couldn't get a hold of him on the radio. And all I know is he's out there with a guy that has a knife. So I send the whole city to him, right? I said literally everyone, because in my mind, I'm just imagining him just getting like ripped to shreds. He's being stabbed, he's hurt. And really what ended up happening is the people that I sent out there found him and he was fine. Later on, when I was talking to this officer and I was like, what on earth happened? I probably even said I peed my pants. I'm not even going to lie. And he was like, oh no, I just wasn't responding to the radio because I had to hold him down. And I was like, well, shit, find a different way to tell me that, because this helplessness feeling really gets built up inside of us. And that goes into this self-narrative piece that's on there too, is a story that we create, because with silence we have nothing. And so we create this image, this self-narrative, that if something's going on, it's usually the worst. And when things do happen, sometimes when they do go bad, we can create a narrative within ourselves as well on what did I do or that made things go bad? Is there a way that I could have helped? What did I do wrong? And when I say that to other responders, they're like, well, what are you talking about? You're in dispatch. And so there's not a whole lot that you can do. How on earth could it ever be your fault? But that is a truth for us in dispatch, because we don't really get to hear that. We just sit up there in our little centers and we think all about all the things that we could have done wrong to make the conclusion of the call, whatever it was. And so also one of the things that popped up when I asked you what's the most stressful part of being a dispatcher was the roller coaster that occurs. And so when asked the average number of calls a day that responders go on, obviously it differs whether you're police, fire, paramedics, things like that, and where in the country you're at, what city you're in, it differs. But the thing to remember is not every call that comes into a dispatch center actually ends up getting dispatched, right? A lot of people call in for who knows what. But for myself, the average number of calls that a dispatcher took in a day at my center was about 100 or a little less than 100 calls a day. And so the officers, again, when I've taught this in the past and I've asked how many calls do you go on a day, they were like 15, 10, some are like 2, some are like none, whatever. But there's surely no one that said that they go on about 100 calls a day. I don't even think that that's physically possible for our field responders out there, but it's a lot of calls that are coming in. And to go to this roller coaster piece, I have CPR calls in here because there's this constant calls that will come in. Like I said, it could be nothing. And so we don't send it out to responders there, and it could be something. And so kind of going down a little bit it says meth CPR in a toaster is a personal example of this. Is I took a call one day of a guy who said, my friend and I just did a bunch of meth and he's not breathing anymore. And so myself, I was like, oh shit, I have to walk this guy through CPR on his friend who's high on meth. But I guess we have to do it, right? I can't just say, oh, you're too far gone. Sorry, can't do that. And so I ended up walking this guy that was high on meth through CPR. And anyone who has had to do that, whether it be on the phone, a field responder actually doing it, knows that if you're doing CPR right, you're probably going to be out of breath, right? This is a strenuous activity here. And so as I'm walking this guy through CPR while he's high on meth, I was really proud of him. I was like, he is doing it. He's out of breath. And I can tell that he's putting in some effort. So I was super excited. You know, I was doing the sit, stare, and panic while I was watching the police cars and the fire engines on the screen come to my call. And they got there. And very, very quickly after arriving, I saw that the officers went code 4 and they called off medical. And I was like, what the hell? And it turns out one of the officers said that the caller was indeed high on meth, and but there was no friend to do CPR on. What he was actually doing CPR on was a pillow. Maybe that was his friend, who knows? But anyways, after I took this call, I was really proud of it, walking this guy high on meth through CPR, super stoked. The very next call that I took after this was an elderly woman who told me that she wanted to heat up her frozen waffles into the toaster, but when she pushed down the toaster button, it wouldn't stay down to heat up the waffles. So she wanted to know, if I push the button down and I hold it there, will my toaster catch on fire? And this is the roller coaster, right? I was just on this weird CPR call, and now she's asking me about pushing a button on her toaster. And I was like, lady, I have no idea. Like, I don't have the energy for this. But this is the roller coaster that I'm talking about. And it says here, it's more than the type of call. It's the accumulation, the emotion, and the lack of decompression. Because kind of putting this whole section together, you get 100 calls in the day. So the amount of time that you get off the phone in between calls is not very much, at least for busier centers, right? And so you get call after call after call after call. One can be a guy high on meth that you have to walk through CPR. One can be a lady who doesn't know what to do about her waffle and her toaster. And this point on here too about CPR calls is usually they're very emotionally charged, right? If we have to walk someone through CPR, it's because someone's dead or near death, right? And we had a call taker one time take a call of a baby who wasn't breathing and had to walk the dad through CPR on the baby. And when she hung up, she was not quick enough to put herself in unavailable. And the very next call that she got was a parent finding their son that had ended up overdosing. And so she had to walk, in the matter of 2 calls, had to walk 2 parents through CPR on their kiddos. And so this is the roller coaster. We can be on our super high highs of the constant CPR calls or shootings or whatever else. And there's also the people that are calling and saying, there's a car outside of my house that I don't recognize. I think it's suspicious. And of course, it always registers back to their neighbor, right? But this is the roller coaster that I'm talking about. That is what I have found to be the second most stressful thing that dispatchers experience. Kind of moving on is the image that we create. Obviously, dispatchers don't get to see the things that are coming into the center via the phone, but one of the most stressful things for us is this image that we end up creating. And humans just naturally have a pessimistic brain. It's kind of how we're wired for survival. And that can be super awesome sometimes when it comes to responder safety. We take a call and our pessimistic brain knows that calls can go from 0 to 100. And so we ask about those responder safety questions about weapons, access to weapons, mental health history, how many people are there, and things like that. And that's great. Our pessimistic brain knows, hey, there's cops coming. People don't like the cops, so we should probably check about weapons. Or, hey, I know this person on the phone. Let me check for warrants and things like that. So our pessimistic brain can be very beneficial when it comes to dispatching. But the drawback of this pessimistic brain is that we oftentimes visualize calls to be a lot worse than they actually are. And this live stream stabbing For example, we had a call come into our center of a stepson who was stabbing his stepdad, or I guess it was son that was stabbing stepdad. Mom was calling in and saying that it was happening. And the son was live streaming him stabbing his stepdad on whatever social media platform it was. I have no idea. But of course, when we get this call, we are just imagining that this scene looks like Carrie, like, sorry if you don't get that reference, but like blood everywhere, or Dexter, whatever, but blood everywhere, just a terrible time. But later on, we had a lieutenant come up to the center and was like, hey, whoever took this call, we have the video of the live stream. Do you want to see it? And of course, we're like, hell yeah, we want to see that. And this is going to sound weird. Every single time that I say this, it sounds weird. But when we watched this video of the stabbing, it really wasn't all that bad. It wasn't. Yes, there was blood, but it wasn't like dripping from the ceiling like we thought it was. It wasn't nearly as bad as the image that we kind of created for it. But this is important when it comes to this image being it always being worse than it is, or the self-narrative portion under the helplessness, like we are always kind of our most critical person, and we're always thinking the worst in calls, and that has its benefits and its drawbacks. But the part here about the babies and puppies is that a lot of times when you ask people, what do you think the most stressful part of being a dispatcher is? A lot of people are like, oh, well, they don't get closure. Which is true, right? There are some calls as dispatchers that we want to know what happened, especially these ones that take like a real emotional toll. We want to know that we did a good job. We want to know that there's no amount of CPR that we could have done to save these people that called in. We want to know the story behind what happened. And we oftentimes don't get that. But I will tell you, the longer that someone is a dispatcher, the less of the closure we need on calls like domestics, where we're going to get them all the time, the same domestics and things like that. The ones that we care more about as you start doing this are babies and puppies. Anything happens to a baby or anything happens to a puppy, we want to know what happened and why it happened. And I'm not a cat person, but I guess some people feel that way about cats too. But as things go on, we care less about the closure, and it's more about this helplessness, the roller coaster, and the image that end up being the most stressful parts. And so how do we respond to calls? I think that this part is one of the more interesting parts here, because a lot of the times people will just assume, they're in a dispatch center, they are safe and sound. We don't understand why they go through trauma. And this kind of helps explain it, how we respond, how our bodies respond to the same sorts of things that are coming into the center that police and fire paramedics respond out on. So when the threat comes in, this is a call that comes in or something that comes in over the radio, and our brain, just like responders, kind of goes into survival mode, this fight or flight mode. And so what happens is blood and oxygen get diverted to large muscle systems needed for this fight or flight response, which is super awesome for police, paramedics, firefighters, because when you get into this survival mode, you do need those large muscle things getting diverted to your legs for running, to your arms for fighting, if that's what you need to do, or for fleeing and things like that. You need that. We'll get into why that's not beneficial for us, but what ends up happening is as your body is diverting the blood and oxygen elsewhere, it's turning off things that it thinks that you don't need when your body's in a fight or flight response. And it turns off things like your fine motor skills, your peripheral vision, and it creates auditory exclusion. And assuming that you guys know a little bit about dispatching, you know that dispatchers rely on their fine motor skills and hearing things, right? And so it says thanks for nothing, because our bodies are not wired to handle, okay, there's something really bad coming in, make sure that she can use her fingers and her ears. That's just not how it's wired. And so another part of this is our brain kind of hones in on one thing. Again, super awesome for police, firefighters, and paramedics, because whether it's a threat, whether it's a patient, whether it's a burning building, your brain focuses on that because that is where your attention is needed. However, being a dispatcher or a call taker, your brain is needed in multiple places at once. You need your ears to be on your caller, you need your eyes to be on your screen, you need to be able to, at least in my center, we have like these little boxes that we communicated with each other from across the room on, but I need to be able to see that in case my dispatcher is hitting me up for questions on a call, or my call taker's trying to say, hey, someone on that call actually does have a weapon. I need my brain to be in multiple places at once, but the body's natural response is saying, hey, that's not what we do in this fight or flight response. We want you to focus on one thing. And for dispatchers, that doesn't work. So where do we go from here, right? What do we do? Well, that's where this retraining comes in. And if you're a dispatcher out there, or I guess really anyone, I think one thing to tell people while they're in training is that training in all of these fields, but training in dispatching in this area is especially hard, because you are literally retraining your brain to hear the worst of the worst things and saying, hey, instead of sending all of the blood and oxygen to my legs and my arms and things that are needed for the fight or flight response, instead, can you please keep my fingers and my ears on? And that's a really hard thing to do. You literally have to retrain your brain to do this job, and that's difficult. So the dispatch trainers of the world out there, that's also something to make sure that your trainees know that this is super hard, and this is why it's hard. You're literally retraining your brain to do what it's naturally there to do. And this is just part of developing a radio ear and being able to multitask. Oh, here's some of my sarcasm. Sorry. But when we talk about dispatch trauma and why dispatchers end up experiencing vicarious trauma, anxiety, depression, things like that, a lot of people, mainly responders maybe, are like, but they're up there crocheting and watching Days of Our Lives. You know, what's the big deal? But to kind of go through why it's a big deal and why dispatchers experience intense stress and trauma is just all of these things together, right? So our bodies have the same response that police and fire and paramedics do. A call comes in, it's something really bad. Our bodies have this fight or flight response, survival mode. But the thing that differs is that dispatchers are very, very limited to what they can do with the same calls that responders are going out on. Our bodies are doing the same things, but we have to react drastically different. That creates the helplessness, the roller coaster that we have to deal with day in and day out. Our imaginations are just running wild. There is, of course, that lack of closure and unanswered questions. Is it as bad as what my brain was making it out to be? Did I do everything that I needed to do? Or was that my fault that an officer got hurt? Or was it my fault that something bad happened on that call? And the calls are still coming in, and there's this continuous exposure to people's traumas and bad things that are happening to people with very little time to decompress, whether it's little time in between calls, whether it's a lack of breaks on shift because you're short staffed, or it's a lack of days off because your center is so short staffed that you have to be there more days in a row. It's this kind of accumulation of things that causes the trauma and stress of being a dispatcher. And so kind of moving into now organizational stress, you know, it's kind of easy to look at these things that bad things come into the phone, and that's really hard for us to hear. And so that makes a little bit more sense on why we're experiencing the stressors that we do. But another component of this is also organizational stress that happens in dispatch centers. And so one of those things, especially for centers that are multidisciplined. So some centers only dispatch for police, some centers only dispatch for fire and medical, and there's centers that do all three, police, fire, and medical. And this can be especially tricky because dispatch has their own set of policies, fire has their own set of policies, paramedics have their own set. This can also happen in centers where they dispatch for multiple counties, right? So this county will have their own set of policies and this county will have theirs. Well, it's the same dispatcher that has to try and keep track of everyone's policies and how they do things. And they are the middleman of these. And that's a big struggle, especially when this county will say that they don't handle this, or you dispatch them thinking that they do handle that. Oh, but wait, no, that's a policy for another county. Or police say, I won't go out on that call. That's not within our policy to on calls I respond out on. That's more of a welfare check or a medical thing. Have fire do that. Well, now we kind of get stuck between we're the middleman between all of these different agencies or all these different professions. And it's really difficult to try and manage that, because at the end of the day, we have to try and get this call out and we just want to get it handled, but everyone has their own things that they have to do. And it's kind of up to us to navigate that. And another part of being a middleman are the political issues that come with this. And so I mean, as I said, I came from Aurora, Colorado's dispatch center. So if you haven't heard about that, just a quick Google search will let you know that I'm here to talk to you about dispatch stress. But the main political issues that happen a lot of times don't realize that how much these large events impact dispatch centers. So for example, the Elijah McClain case happened in the center that I dispatch for, or it happened in the department that I dispatch for. And I remember working during a time where something happened in court. I've taught this several times and I still don't remember, but there was something that happened in court regarding this case. And I was working the day that something was decided or something happened. And the amount of calls that we got about it was insane. And I ended up asking, when I was creating this presentation, I ended up asking the IT guy for the department on the difference of calls that we got during that time versus before the Elijah McClain incident happened. And he said in that one day that I'm talking about, I think it was like August something, but that one day that I was talking about, we took the same amount of calls in that one day that the center does in about a week and a half. And it's not just locally people who are upset and want to let you know that they're upset. No. It's not locally or just locally. It's around the world. We were getting calls from people in Canada. We were getting calls from people in England. We were getting calls from just about everywhere, of course, mainly within the country. But going back to that, the calls are always coming in when calls were kind of starting to decrease because people are starting to go to bed, right? And so they don't want to yell at us now, they're going to go to bed. The problem is that, okay, on the other side of the world, they're all waking up. So if we're not hearing it from America right now, we're going to be hearing it from England here soon. And so that also is a major component to this middleman, is that the police did something, and I won't get into the politics of this, but the police did something, people are upset about it. And when they go to try and tell someone how upset they are about how the police did things wrong, when they kind of Google who to talk to, it's not IA that pops up. It's not our PIO that pops up. It is the dispatch number. So day after day after day after day, we are getting an insane amount of calls on people saying the worst things in the world to you constantly, and just the standard calls that are coming in. We're having to find ways to kind of field out calls of people who are just calling us to tell us that they hope that we die and all these things, in between legitimately calls for service that the city needs to respond out on, medical calls, shootings, the city doesn't stop. And so that is extremely difficult, because we will be the first person, obviously, if you're out on the street, I'm sure people will kind of yell at you about the political issues of the world. But that is the first number, or people that are reached in political issues when the world is pissed off and they want to let you know it's your dispatchers that they get to talk to. How exciting. But another piece of this organizational stress in dispatch centers is the difference between being classified as a clerical or a protected position. And so most dispatch centers around the country, maybe even the world, I'm not sure, for sure the country, are classified as clerical. And so what this means is that we have the same classification as your receptionist at a dentist office or Susan at Comcast. Those are all clerical positions, and dispatchers are considered that too. And I know that there's kind of like this feud going on if dispatchers should be considered first responders and they don't risk their life, they're not responders, things like that, whatever. But to be completely honest, I don't know a single dispatcher out there that's like, I really need to be called a first responder and I really need to be recognized for what I do. I honestly don't know a ton of those. The main thing that comes with this is that because we are classified the same as the receptionist and the same as Susan at Comcast, because of that, this puts a huge limit onto what kind of resources dispatchers have. So it caps our salary to a lot less than what responders get. It limits us on training. It limits the center for the amount of monetary resources that they get. Mental health resources is a big one too. Many dispatch centers don't have psychological contracts with culturally competent places that can kind of handle this sort of stuff. They don't really have contracts with that very much, or they have very limited ones where they're like, well, you get 3 sessions per work-related incident. Whereas more and more we're seeing that police and fire departments are getting a lot more mental health resources. And part of that is because we are classified as a receptionist. And I mean, maybe they do, I don't know. I haven't been a receptionist before, but the receptionists don't need the mental health care and things like that, like a dispatcher does. And another part of this is retirement benefits. And so this also plays a part, if we go back to kind of slide 1, this also plays a part into that overtime and retention and things like that, because if you're not getting paid very much, you don't have decent training, you don't have any mental health resources that to keep up with the things that you're hearing and experiencing, and the benefits are weak, then why on earth would people sign up to do this, right? It takes a certain type of person to look at these things and be like, yeah, I still want to do this. But it's not as much. And so that's part of the problem on why our centers are falling apart, is because they don't have those resources. And it's really just a classification change. You classify your dispatchers as first responders or a protected class, and it changes the game. But not a lot of places are getting on board on that. I know my center did recently, and I mean as recent as like a year or 2 ago, they were able to change from clerical to protected, or that first responder thing, which totally changes the game for the amount of resources that you get. But my center was just lucky. Most centers do not have those privileges. And so now as we kind of, that's the dispatch stuff over there. But you'll see also some similarities as we get into support services on the stressors that they go through. And I think maybe I've started calling them the forgotten people, but you know, there's different professions, just like dispatchers, how we kind of get roped into the checking on our officers, checking on our firefighters. We forget about the dispatchers and the other people. That leads us to support services, and to start out are our records clerks. Like, who on earth thinks, I know I'm guilty of this too, but who on earth thinks to check on our records people, right? And why should we check on them? So I ended up asking a records clerk, what's the most stressful part of your job? Like, let us in and figure out how we can help. And you'll see as we kind of go through this, these common things that are the same with dispatch, but records also struggles with this middleman thing. And a quote that I took from talking to this records clerk was, everyone touches us. And that sounds, I should change that, but I know I'm not going to. There's no sex assault here, everyone calm down. But when she says everyone touches us, it's because they are this kind of hub, right? Dispatch has to talk to them to figure out things on calls, past calls, case numbers, whatever. Police talk to them because every report they take or ticket they write kind of gets funneled through dispatch, or sorry, kind of gets funneled through records. And the courts talk to them, other agencies talk to them, and things like that. Everyone kind of touches records. We all need them. And that is a lot to handle when we talk about different policies and things that people need. And that leads down to this, officers not understanding the records process, on how records has to do stuff to kind of help with this middleman thing that we have going on. So if the courts need things done this way, but police don't really do that thing to help, well, then the police put it in and records gets it, and they have to do something to make it pretty to go off to the courts or whatever it may be, but they don't understand that process. And it may just take a little bit of understanding and learning to kind of get there on how I can best help in this process. And so everyone's kind of touching them. The police may not understand. And to be honest, everyone may not understand. I'm sure dispatchers or whoever, fire don't as well. And the public is also doing what they do. So they come into records because they want copies of reports. They want copies of this, or they need to talk to so-and-so. And so they are the middleman between the public and dispatch, police and fire, courts, other agencies. They're kind of this main central hub. And another thing is this funnel effect. And so if you look at the top of this funnel that I have there in the background, I have here every report you write, ticket you give, crime scene you work goes through your support services. And so records is kind of going to be this tip there at the bottom of the funnel, where the city or county jurisdiction that you're working in has all of these things that are coming in through a very small amount of people. And so if you're super stressed out because crimes are increasing and your workload is increasing, you're going to more calls for service, well, your dispatchers are likely also stressed because you don't know about the call unless they do. And your records clerks are too, because all of this stuff is also going through them. So I have on here, if you're in the fire, they are also feeling the heat. And another support service to also recognize is our CSI techs. And this one kind of blew my mind. I reached out to a CSI tech and I asked, the same question that I do, what is the most stressful part about your job? And naturally we think, well, they have to see some pretty nasty stuff. But the number one thing that she told me that kind of affects CSI techs retention levels is the safety aspect of being a CSI. And if you're like, what the heck? I said the same thing, because the CSI tech said while they are on scene, sometimes they aren't being covered or protected by their officers there. And so she said she'll go to a scene where a suspect is there and they may be detained, but she's there to do what she has to do. And the officers are either on their phone or they're off talking to a suspect, or they're getting statements from these people. And you have a civilian, because at the end of the day, I would like to say most of them are, I think, but you have a civilian that's in your crime scene with a suspect still on scene. We wouldn't just let anyone walk in, at least unprotected or covered. So why do we do that with our CSI techs, right? And so again, like everyone else, they have this view of the world. They literally see the worst of the worst. A lot of times they see the calls coming in, they have this pessimistic brain. Our view of reality starts to change on the bad things that are happening out there. And so they go into these scenes also thinking the worst, but also not having backup or cover for them to protect them while they're there. Okay. And so of course this trauma aspect too, right? And so this CSI tech has worked some pretty big, one of them was the STEM school shooting, and another one was an officer who died, a line of duty death. She worked these scenes, and she said that she a lot of the times has to return to the scene of prior scenes that she's worked for other things that are going on. And it even happens to her as a CSI tech. She gets there and smells of gunpowder or blood or whatever else come back. She gets flashbacks of these things, and she has to be professional when she responds out, and she has to get the best evidence that she can. I say she, but that they can when they go out there. They have to do what they have to do, but they're also having a very natural human response, being back at a scene that was very traumatic also for them. And this on scene in the court, it kind of goes into that, at the end of the day, CSI techs want to catch the bad guys, just like we all do. That's why we're in this, right? We want to provide safety, and we want to be a part of this super cool environment where we deal with the worst of the worst, but we provide the best of the best. And so we have our CSI techs out there on scene trying to get the best evidence that they can, but they may be having a very natural reaction to an abnormal event that they experience, or they may be a bit anxious because they don't feel safe in the environment that they're in. And another part that creates the stress for our CSI techs is the closure that we kind of talked about also with dispatchers. Are they see these terrible things and they have to process them and collect all this evidence, and they want to catch the bad guy and they want to help out as much as they can, but then they hear nothing after that. They try and do their best to catch the bad guy, to have charges stick and things like that, but they never hear if they did a good job on it. Like, hey, the evidence that you collected was able to lead us to finding out that the suspect is so-and-so, or it helped us create a really good timeline of what happened, things like that. They have no idea. So they do the best that they can with what they are given, but they never actually hear if they do a good job, which is kind of sad. Another thing to think about is debriefs. I think officers and fire are pretty good at doing debriefs for calls that are really nasty, but our CSI techs go out there to the same scene that responders went to. They have to do the job that they do by seeing some pretty nasty stuff and having to look at it in detail and get everything that they need to help with the case. But sometimes they're kind of forgotten in debriefs. So they do end up getting this closure so they can find out if they did an okay job. And the same thing with follow-ups on cases. I asked the CSI tech, do you want them to call and tell you, like, hey, just so you know, that case that you worked that was pretty tough, we were just able to charge the guy with so and so, and this is his sentence. And her response was yes, like she wants that kind of feedback, but they oftentimes don't get that. So safety, trauma, and this closure is really tough for our CSI techs too. And victims advocates, when I asked them, what's the hardest part or the most stressful part of your job? The first one was the emotional toll, and emotions are hard. And so the victims advocates aren't really called, going back to the dispatch thing where it's like the emotional calls are typically the hardest ones on us. Victims advocates aren't usually called if people are handling whatever happened well, right? They're called because someone is having a very normal response to an abnormal event, and they want someone who is equipped to handle those emotions and help people with those there. And so what happens is victim advocates are going out, and kind of the emotional toll is pushed on to them because that's part of their job, sure, but that can also really bog a person down, is listening to the emotions that really get us time after time after time after time. And like I said, it is their job. If you're sitting there wondering, well, that's what they signed up for, to be a victim's advocate. Sure, we all sign up for something, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't take a toll on us too. So it is their job, but having to carry those emotions of a lot of different things for some really traumatic events is really difficult. And the victims advocates also experience the same thing as we talked about with records, is this funnel. There's tons of officers out there for the city or the county that you're working in, but a very, very small amount of victims advocates that are dealing with the trauma and the emotions that come from that. And a thing to remember with this too is that, you know, whether you're a fire personnel or police or paramedics that respond out to the call, you type your reports, you get your case numbers, you do what you do with the call, and then when you close it out, it's done. Yes, you may get subpoenaed later on and things like that, but for the most part, it's done. You continue on, you go to the next call, things like that. But the victims advocates, the call isn't over when it's closed out on the police end. You know, they deal with helping them through big milestones with court and things like that. And so it's this never ending funnel because I say longer lifespan, but their caseload goes on for a longer period of time. It's not just closed out at the end of the day when you checked all your boxes for things that you have to do. Theirs go on for a long time. And then we're adding more into the top of the funnel, more calls that are coming in. We need our victims advocates a lot more. And so they are also being spread very thin with some really, really emotional stuff that can bog down their system. And so we talked about records and victims advocates and CSI techs, but I'm also sure that there's other support services out there that I'm not thinking, or there's things that were on these slides with the dispatch and our support services that I didn't think of. And so I kind of put my information down there too. So if there's a support service that you can think of that you really want to be included, that you think that people need to know more about, or there's things that you want to add or emphasize on support services or dispatch, again, my name is Mel and here's my email address, and I would love to hear about more. Like I said, I worked in dispatch, so a lot of these I went out there to get this information, but I'd also like to hear about who else we can cover, what else that we can do to kind of help unite us all. So feel free to reach out if you do have some of that information. All right, thank you.